So this one's been a long time coming. Tywin Lannister is probably my favorite character in Game of Thrones. I mean, I have three favorite characters: Tywin, Davos, and Sansa, with Stannis, I guess, being a fourth. But I've always really liked Tywin. Well, I guess maybe always isn't a good way of putting it. Because when I read the books, he just seemed like the big bad. He just kind of seemed like a cartoon villain. Whereas in the show, I think Charles Dance really brought the character to life. I remember the first time I watched the show, because I watched it after I read the books, and there's that awesome scene where he's skinning the deer like a boss, and he's talking to Jamie, and he has his speech about family. The character just clicked for me. I had never really understood his motivations other than being a mustache twirling villain, but he became more than that in the show. He became kind of a complicated character with his own motivations and stuff like that. And as I kind of like learned more about the lore of the show, it really started to kind of show me how Tywin became the man he was today. And once you kind of delve into the backstory, you see more and more that Tywin is a very complicated character. He's not just this kind of pure evil mustache twirling villain. He, I think, more than just about anybody else in the show, kind of epitomizes the moral ambiguities, the kind of contradictions of his age, kind of the nature of the Game of Thrones, I guess you could say. So I kind of like to think of Tywin as a character whose virtues and vices fairly evenly balance each other's out, and it kind of makes him a bit enigmatic. On one hand, Tywin is exceedingly cruel and will kill people or make examples of them with little, with no real concern. On the other hand, I don't think he's necessarily sadistic in the same way that Ramsay, Roose, or Joffrey are. Tywin likes to use cruelty, brutality, and torture as pragmatic weapons to send a certain message, weapons to enhance House Lannister's reputation and create an environment of fear. Like when he destroyed the Rains and Tarbacks, he didn't do it necessarily because he likes killing people. He did it because they were in open revolt. His house was in a state of extreme weakness, and he had to make an example out of them. It's kind of any strong lord in that situation who wants to be taken seriously. If you have vassals who are revolting because they won't pay back loans they took in bad faith, you're going to have to destroy them. It's just something you kind of have to do. And Tywin used brutality, like severe brutality there, but it accomplished what he set out to do. He was able to restore order to the Westerlands, restore the name of House Lannister, and to a certain extent, Tywin justifies a lot of his actions with a little evil for the greater good. As he says, why is it more just to kill 10,000 men in the battlefield than 100 men at dinner? And there's some truth to that. Did Tywin do that as some kind of compassionate humanitarian thing? No, but Tywin is, if nothing else, a pragmatist, and wasting his resources and enemies who, once defeated, will become vassals again, wasting their resources on a pointless war when he can end it in a much more efficient manner, just doesn't really appeal to him. Tywin isn't a stupid man, nor is he stupid evil. So you have kind of that contradiction. He's exceedingly cruel, but he's also exceedingly pragmatic and very unwilling to waste resources that they can be put to good use. Now, I just kind of chose this at random, but the quote here is, "When your enemies defy you, you must serve them steel and fire. When they go to their knees, however, you must help them back to their feet, elsewise no man will ever bend the knee to you." So you have that aspect. You have Tywin's pride. Tywin's an immensely prideful man. He takes immense pride in his house. He will not tolerate any dissent, any disloyalty, any of his vassals kind of getting up in his face. On the other hand, Tywin is exceedingly able to put his pride aside and delay gratification and endure humiliation for the sake of his house and for the sake of long-term plans. It should be noted that the second half of his tenure as Hand, Aerys frequently humiliated him, mocked him, undermined him, and wouldn't let him resign because he wanted to keep him around to continue humiliating him. And yet Tywin bore all these insults and slights without any complaint and just continued on as best as he could. Despite being an immensely prideful man, and despite the fact that Aerys treated him like garbage, for the sake of his house's long-term prosperity and for the sake of his own plans, he was able to delay gratification, to delay telling the king to F off. So that, I think, is a very important thing. Another important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about Tywin Lannister is, while he's exceedingly prideful, he's also exceedingly willing to put that pride aside for what he sees as the greater good. And that's kind of another of kind of the contradictions of Tywin Lannister, is while he is very, I guess you could say, selfish in some ways, he married for love, he didn't remarry and have more children, despite the fact that as a male you can pretty much remarry whenever and father more children. It's not like with women. Despite the fact that he allowed his personal hatred of Tyrion to get in the way of properly utilizing him, and you can find a lot of examples of him being selfish. At his core, Tywin does fundamentally believe that his motivations aren't selfish and they're for the greater good of his house. He does put family first. He does put the name and blood of his house before everything else. And like I said, he was willing to endure being tormented by the Mad King. He's willing to endure Robert. He's willing to endure Joffrey for the sake of his house's long-term prosperity. And I don't think it's just cynicism. I don't think it's just him using it. I think he does genuinely believe it. Because if nothing else, Tywin is kind of the archetype of the patriarch. He's the patriarch of House Lannister. Everybody owes him fealty, but at the same time, he owes them all protection, and he owes acting in their interest. Everything he's ever done has been for the greater good of House Lannister. And while a lot of members of his house fear him and probably don't like him, they do respect him, and they do certainly agree with the fact that he is going to... I mean, if we look at Tywin's master plan by the time we reach the end of book, by the time of Storm of Swords, we have his blood sitting on the Iron Throne. We will have his blood sitting on the seat of Winterfell, and once Cersei and Willis Tyrell marry, they'll have his blood sitting on the seat of Highgarden. So you'll have, plus the Westerlings, so you'll have 3 of the 7 kingdoms along with the Iron Throne having Lannister blood sitting upon them. As one person in the forums commented, that's one hell of a legacy. The Lannisters, under his rule, while they lost a great deal of wealth and they took severe casualties in the war, they emerged from the war along with the Tyrells as the undisputed masters of the 7 kingdoms. Really, they had succeeded in destroying all of their enemies, and there was really no one left who could stand against them. So he was able to accomplish great things for his family. Despite his many shortcomings, being able to provide for his family is certainly not one of them. You can never really accuse Tywin Lannister of not pretty consistently putting family first. And on that note, one of the other interesting things about Tywin is he is diligent, he's extremely hard worker, and he is not corrupt. What do I mean by not corrupt? Tywin doesn't seems like the kind of man who would not pick a piece of gold off the floor if he came across it, simply because he considers it beneath him to resort to that sort of thing. I'm sure when he was Hand of the King, he probably didn't pocket any of the money for himself, or if he did it to a much lesser extent than previous people did. I think he views that as a bourgeoisie thing. Kind of a traditional aspect of nobility is a disdain for wealth. The aristocrat has a certain disdain for wealth, which is kind of ironic given Tywin Lannister. But I think losing his honor and losing his house's prestige for money is not something he would really be interested in or something he would be willing to do. So you have that aspect of Tywin Lannister. And when he was Hand of the King, he did, by all accounts, an excellent job. Well, I disagree with the fact that he undid all of the reforms Aegon V did to help the small folk. At the same time, he did dramatically overhaul the Seven Kingdoms' income. He made it exceedingly prosperous. Under Aerys II, the realm had a period of peace, prosperity, and just general, well, I guess just peace and prosperity covers it. But he was the extremely able administrator who fostered trade, lowered taxes, and increased royal revenues. That's where the expression that Tywin Lannister shits gold bricks to a certain extent comes from. And he was beloved throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Well, maybe not beloved, but respected almost universally throughout the Seven Kingdoms for his abilities. One thing Tywin isn't is someone who boasts without the abilities and the power to back it up. So it's like, on a micro level, Tywin is cruel, he's brutal to those around him, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to maintain his house's honor and power. On the other hand, he's done more net good for the realm than many other characters. He did govern for, what was it, like 10, 20 years, and brought a period of near unrivaled prosperity. He made the Westerlands orderly again and brought prosperity back to them after the weakness of his father. In the show, we frequently see him that he spends basically all of his free time working and works late into the night. He is not lazy, he's not self-indulgent, he doesn't really put his own pleasures very high. To a certain extent, duty matters to him. It's kind of perhaps a more twisted version of duty than some of the other lords we see in the series, like Ned, but it's duty all the same. He frequently saw Joffrey as a nuisance because he was too busy working and trying to fix the realm. Ironically, that's kind of one of the issues with what Tyrion did in killing him, is they were heading into a winter in a climate in which a lot of the food stores had either been destroyed or left to rot in the fields because of the warfare and because the men weren't home to harvest. And Tywin was probably the last man who would have been able, as Hand of the King, to make it work, to try to patch together what was left of the economy, to redistribute grain, to take out additional loans and purchase it from door and end across the narrow sea. He probably could have been able to rebuild the realm and see it through the long winter. Unfortunately, when Tyrion killed him, there was really no one else. And I think if you can say there's one core problem with Tywin Lannister, and Cersei says this a great amount in this show, it's the fact that, like with many men who possess extreme talents, who are so much more talented than their kin at what they do, I think it's a flaw a lot of them have, that they don't understand that their successors, it's very hard to find another man of that talent, and it's even harder to ensure that you're succeeded by another man of that talent. So, like, some historical examples of that would be Justinian, of the Emperor of Byzantium. His accomplishments are numerous. He reconquered large portions of the former Western Roman Empire, including North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. He undertook huge building projects, religious reforms, etc. He was they redid the legal code. Any one of Justinian's accomplishments would have made another emperor a great king, but he was a man of such extreme abilities that he was able to carry out all of these simultaneously. The problem was, it's very hard to find another Justinian. And once he died, a lot of his stuff just immediately started to fall apart. The Byzantines lost a lot of his conquests because they were kind of built on sand. The economy had a lot of issues, and eventually the Arabs would utterly devastate most of the Byzantine Empire, including retaking pretty much everything he had conquered, well, them along with the various tribes that invaded Italy. So that there's a case of that. Augustus is another case, and a lot of Roman emperors have this issue. Marcus Aurelius, Augustus, Constantine. in which you have a man of extreme talents who undertakes very ambitious projects, but once they die, their successor or their successors are not up to the task of maintaining something. Otto von Bismarck is another example. Otto von Bismarck had created this complex system of alliances to keep Europe from tearing itself apart. Unfortunately, once he was dismissed and once he died, his extremely complicated network of stuff fell to lesser men like Kaiser Wilhelm, and they didn't understand what Bismarck had done, and they didn't know how to maintain it, and the accomplishments of Bismarck turned out to be net negatives. And to a certain extent, that's true with Tywin. He had this complicated series of marriages, diplomatic agreements, financial things, military things. He was a man of extreme talents who was willing to work extremely hard to kind of maintain the realm. On the other hand, though, he was the only man who could do it. I mean, who else in House Lannister is really capable? Kevin could do probably 70% of what Tywin could do, which is why he becomes which is why he becomes regent in the books, and why Varys winds up killing him, because Kevin probably would have been able to do a pretty good job and get the realm through the winter. That's not to say anything. Kevin is an exceedingly talented and incompetent and able man, but Tywin Lannister is a once-a-generation kind of administrative genius. But if you look at his children, which one of them is fit to carry on his legacy? Cersei is crazy, stupid, lazy, and arrogant, with nothing to back it up. I mean, Tywin Lannister is super arrogant too, but Tywin Lannister, he's not a man to trifle with. He could back up all of his arrogance, and he will destroy you if you mess with him. If you call, he doesn't bluff, so you better not call his bluff. Jaime is another just complete disaster of a child. He's also just doesn't want to rule for some reason. He wants to serve in the Kingsguard. He's like a man-child who never really decided what he wanted to be when he grew up. And Tywin favors him just because he's good-looking and strong. Tyrion, well, more like Tywin and probably more able to maintain his administrative and diplomatic stuff, is also a screw-up. Now, I'm not just saying that because he's a dwarf, although that's part of it, but Tywin, I think, has a point when he talks about Tyrion's whoring and drinking being an embarrassment to the house. I think Tyrion misunderstands Tywin. While Tywin disapproves of his actions in general, what really bothers him is the fact that Tyrion does it in the open. That he hangs out with whores in public, he gets drunk in public, he's just an embarrassment. If Tyrion was more discreet with his various vices, I think Tywin would still disapprove of them, but he'd be a lot less antagonistic towards his son. But Tyrion, I think, would also probably be a disaster because, while smarter, people aren't going to respect a dwarf. It's just the way it is. And also, there's a decent chance, like he says, I will not let you turn Casterly Rock into a whorehouse. Tyrion probably would turn Casterly Rock into a whorehouse. I mean, he brings Shae around with him. When they go to Winterfell, he immediately shacks up with a bunch of prostitutes. He drinks a lot. So, while I think Tywin has some respect for his son's abilities, he also just, he's not fit to carry on his legacy either. So, honestly, that was kind of I think one of his other big issues is he never really decided the succession. Even though he's getting up in years, he always believed that he'd be able to get Jaime out of the Kingsguard, and I guess he did, sort of. But at the same time, Jaime is a fuck-up. Jaime isn't, like, really fit or capable of replacing him. Probably what would have been best if he had have named Daeron Lannister or Kevin Lannister, or just picked some other competent male Lannister and declared him his heir. Maybe pick Kevin Lannister. Lancel fortunately disinherited himself by joining a religious order, and just tell Kevin, train one of your younger sons to be a ruler. You can just serve as kind of as a caretaker until they're ready to rule. That probably would have been the smart thing, but that just didn't really wind up happening, and I don't know if Tywin would have done that. But no, his children are complete fuck-ups. And I think to a certain extent he's kind of ignorant of that, or he overlooks it because he's concerned by his legacy. Of his children, Cersei's probably the worst because she thinks she's like Tywin. She calls herself Tywin with teats, but she lacks kind of all the abilities of Tywin. Tywin was able to be diplomatic. If not charming, he was able to use the carrot and the stick. Cersei only knows how to use the stick, and there's a difference between intimidating people and just insulting them. Tywin doesn't necessarily insult people. He makes them feel inferior. He makes them feel fear, but he doesn't necessarily just insult them. I think another interesting scene is when in the show, when he's like, look, it was really stupid to behead Ned. We could have traded him for Jaime, and that would have resolved this war. But now we're going to have to fight this stupid war because my grandson is intensely dumb. And I think that was probably the most depressing aspect of Tywin's life, is that his grandson, his legacy, was a complete and utter disaster, and probably would have brought the dynasty down. To be fair, he's probably relieved when Tommen becomes king, because even if Tommen is not particularly strong, Tommen is at least likable. People don't actively despise him. I mean, you don't have to be loved, but if you're universally hated by everybody, that's a really, really bad situation to be in. So you have that aspect of Tywin Lannister. But I think I've covered most of the points I wanted to get across. Tywin Lannister is a man of contradictions. While cruel, he could also... He was not necessarily sadistic or unnecessarily so. While greedy and ambitious, he was also an extremely hard-working, able administrator whose rule, while harsh, brought prosperity, order, and stability to those under him. I think a point I forgot to mention is when he became Lord of Casterly Rock, he sent Kevin and a bunch of knights to just go and slaughter all of the robbers and outlaws in the Westerlands, restoring trade and protecting the small folk and the lords, ironically enough, despite his hatred of the small folk. While he's very condescending often to his family, he's an exceedingly able patriarch and very capable of ensuring good futures, good marriages, and titles and wealth for his various family members. While arrogant and self-absorbed, he was willing to put his family first and set aside his pride from time to time in order to advance his house. So yes, Tywin is a man of many contradictions whose vices and virtues are pretty easily balanced. I think he really kind of embodies the morally ambiguous nature of much of the show and is an excellent character. So that's kind of my profile of Tywin Lannister. I hope it was interesting. I hope maybe you learned something, and I'll talk to you guys later.